My name is Annie, and today my presentation is MRV in Action, Reducing Methane from Natural Gas. I am another MBA E-IPER student. I come from a social impact background, and just want to give a huge thank you to Dr. Naomi Bonas, who was my advisor and is a really great mentor to a lot of people throughout the campus. So there's no silver bullet for the climate crisis, but one thing that can buy us more time is methane mitigation. About a third of the global temperature rise is coming from just the methane that we are releasing into the air. And while methane doesn't hang out in the atmosphere for as long as carbon dioxide, it is 80 times more potent in the first 20 years. We need to reduce these emissions by 35 to 40%, no big deal in just the next 6 years, to remain on track for a middle ground climate scenario. Now, the bad news is that we are on the worst track scenario for methane emissions. And if you want to learn more about this, the Global Carbon Budget released an excellent report in September. A lot of Stanford professors contribute to that. And they talk about how we have made some impact on carbon emissions, we have made no progress, and are only getting worse on methane. A big part of this is because the world needs energy. The world needs that energy to be cheap, and natural gas is still a lower carbon energy source compared to oil and coal. And so this has been actually one of the biggest factors for the methane rise in the last 20 years, is the consumption and production of natural gas. A lot of countries, regardless of how you and I might think about this, see natural gas as a bridge fuel to decarbonize, and so we can only imagine that this demand is going to increase. Furthermore, we're experiencing a bit of a lock-in effect because just in the last 5 years, LNG, liquid natural gas export capacity around the world has actually gone up about 40%. So the more infrastructure you build, the more incentive there is to continue producing and selling natural gas. And so the best place to start talking about this is in the United States because we are the world's biggest exporter. And in the upcoming administration, there's going to be a huge priority to expand our oil and gas sales around the world. Now, the good news is that when it comes to oil and gas methane emissions compared to something like dairy or cattle, this is a known problem, and the solutions are also known. We know that about 60% of these emissions are coming just from the production aspect of the supply chain, and for gas producers, about half of these are coming from just two pieces of equipment. So if we can find and fix the leak, we can actually make a really big dent in methane emissions. This is not a technology issue. This is not a fundamental science issue. This is an industry coordination problem. So the bottleneck that we have is MRV, measurement, reporting, and verification. And I'll go into each of these in a second. But I just wanted to mention that MRV is not unique to methane. For any carbon or emissions intervention, you need a system where you can measure, report, and verify that emissions reductions is happening with high integrity. Without this, you can't have effective regulations, you can't price carbon or understand what kind of carbon markets should emerge, and you also don't know what industry standards and procedures should be that are best practice. My capstone has been a series of interviews, some case studies and literature reviews to create a white paper that is industry facing on what can industry do on its own, knowing that regulations are going to be a little bit off in the next couple of years, at least domestically, to reduce emissions. And the key recommendations are on how we can accelerate the adoption of MRV systems specifically for methane. And part of the implementation is that there is a Fortune 15 tech company whose scope 2 emissions, like all these big tech companies, are really blowing up out of control due to AI, data centers, all of that stuff. And they're really interested in positioning their product and sustainability strategy around methane abatement. So let's start talking a little bit more about MRV, starting with measurement, and put ourselves in the shoes of a gas producer. If you're a gas producer, there's actually a lot of tools that you can use off the shelf today to set this baseline reference level for your emissions. You can do things like do a manned aerial flight. You might only do that 2 or 3 times a year, but all your technicians that are walking around your production facility might use something like a flow meter to do live detection of leaks. The point is, all these tools are different. You're going to use a variety of them, and each of them will detect leaks or emissions under different operating conditions. So you'll take all this data, and then you come up with your emissions profile. You then move on to reporting. And if you are a producer of a certain size in the United States, you're going to report this to the EPA, specifically the EPA's Greenhouse Gas Inventory Program, which manages a lot of information on emissions at the facility level. And this is one of the first big problems that we're having with MRV today. because the EPA does not do first-party measurements on its own. It uses its own set of methodologies and data streams. And all the research so far has said that their inventory is completely off base for methane emissions. One study says these emissions must be 63% higher, another said they must be 3 times bigger, and another says they're off by a factor of 2 to 5. So big gap on MRV here. You have the biggest regulator making decisions off what a lot of people think is completely inaccurate data. I'm not going to talk too much about verification because it's the most nascent aspect in methane, but I just wanted to mention that you might have seen these satellites that have been launched in the last couple of years. There's the EDF methane sat, there's greenhouse gas sat, there's carbon mapper. These all are trying to become that third-party verification system for regulators and for industry producers. Right now, we don't know how they're actually going to work with regulators or producers, but they have a lot of potential in filling out the V part of this equation. To move into some of our industry recommendations, the first one is that it's worth acknowledging there's a lot of success stories among gas producers. Many of them have reduced their emissions and have collected a lot of data on how to do this well. And so sharing these stories, especially through a fit-for-purpose technology guide, can be really useful to share with other producers on how they can reduce their emissions footprint. And fundamentally, the question you really want to try to answer is what technologies work best under what conditions. As gas production expands around the world, this can also be then later applied to producers for who this technology is very, very new. The second thing is the role of small producers and marginal wells. So small producers are only generating about 6% of the country's output of natural gas, but they own the dirtiest assets. Over 50% of methane emissions probably comes from these marginal wells, which are towards the end of their life. So this basically means that large producers can be doing a lot more work to bring technical assistance and financial solutions for small producers to implement methane MRV. The last thing I'll talk about is when we talk about industry action, one of the most important parts of the industry is customers themselves. And so as we enter this time period where regulation is going to be pretty inconsistent, one of the biggest points of intervention is actually customers demanding better products or better data around the gas that they are buying. So if you are that large tech company, or in this case, if you're E-IPER, which is a German gas utility that's going to be buying a lot of gas. So promoting things like independent certification standards or increasing the adoption of MRV systems throughout the supply chain can really be done by enhancing consumer demand for this kind of data. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
I think I saw something about cost and recovery levels having economic impact on a price slide. Can you talk a little bit about that trade-off? Because I think typically there's a perception that, like, you know, fixing this stuff is a cost center, it's expensive, but I suspect maybe that's not always the case here. I'd love to hear a bit more.
It's probably the biggest case for the small producers. Their number one reason for not engaging in any kind of MRV is the tools cost too much, and then they don't want to know there's a problem because then they're on the hook for fixing it, and that costs them more money. And they're really just trying to squeeze the life out of these assets, right? And so that can be a problem, and that is something that also some of the success stories where they can come in handy because, for example, Triple Crown, because they implemented these systems, Triple Crown is not a small producer, but because they implemented these solutions, they were actually able to boost their bottom line revenue by 2.5%. So there's different kind of techniques around how you're accounting for these costs that can be shared in industry, but the small producers definitely need something like a fund set up to just pay for it because they have no incentive to implement any kind of MRV or monitoring.
Great job, Ainee. Are there any regulations right now for reporting the emissions? And if there are, how are they reporting? Because I know some people, they just like do mathematical calculations, but I don't know if there's like any sensors or technology.
Yeah, so I guess there's two answers here. One is that, there's a whole stack of tools that these producers use, and then a lot of methodologies that are prescribed by the EPA, and they work with, there's certain reporting firms that just help them combine all this data to come up with this emissions profile. And then the EPA, like I said, has its own methodology. On the point of regulation, one of the regulations that was supposed to go online this year that probably will not is that there was going to be a waste emissions charge. So if you exceeded a certain methane intensity for your production, the EPA was going to fine you $900 a ton for every excess ton, and then that was only going to go up over time. Now, whether this regulation was actually going to work, no one really knows just yet because some of this measurement is so far off base. But the problem is that because the Trump administration is coming online, you can expect that regulation to go away altogether. Yeah.
Why is it so off base? Like, why are the numbers so far off?
I think it's because, like I said, so an easy way to explain this is actually one of the interviews said this really clearly to me. They said, you can imagine each of these tools or even each of these satellites being like a camera, and each of these tools is a different lens. So different kind of resolution on the emissions. If you're taking a picture from space, is it at the facility level? Is it at the country level? Different operating conditions for different producers, different like geomorphological conditions for the gas basins themselves. There's a variety of reasons why these measurements are off, and the only way forward is just to increase just all the time how much you're measuring it so you can synthesize better data.
Great job. Just staying on this page, like the point of reference I have is in testing, inspection, and certification market of more traditional industrial systems, where instead of taking on the risk of all of these tools in-house, you outsource it to like a services business, and they kind of retain and synthesize the information. Why do you think that business model hasn't been adopted here?
So it is. I think this is a very nascent ecosystem compared to other kinds of emissions, especially carbon emissions. All of these tools are the kinds of startups that you hear about, a lot of these technology providers. And one of them that I interviewed, Project Canary, which was actually run by a GSB grad now, they actually shifted their business model entirely to be around just this synthesis piece, because they realized what the market really needed is a data and kind of like a tech agnostic solution that allows you to crunch all the numbers versus another set of sensors or another piece of hardware. So they've done really well, but I think this pivot has been pretty recent for them. So it remains to be seen like where all of this work will go.